Well, it's a combination of genetics, childhood attachment trauma, and emotional neglect. My dad is diagnosed as bipolar, and so was his mother. She was institutionalized and later on ended up setting their house on fire. So obviously there is trauma there as well. My mom's side of the family has nothing diagnosed, but has had many family and financial struggles throughout the generations, which contributed to the lack of emotional connection, which left my mom with the inability to be emotionally supportive and emotionally available for me. I also think that I was a very empathic and sensitive child, so being the youngest of four, I ended up just disappearing outside of all the family chaos. I feel so much compassion for me as a little girl because I was such a bright, imaginative, and wonderful little girl. I just was in the wrong environment to help that flourish. Instead, my childhood left me with core feelings of shame, anxiety, irritability, and anger. I experienced many traumatic things throughout life, which is why I was diagnosed with CPTSD also, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. These were things I either experienced personally or witnessed happening. Some of the traumatic things that I experienced at a very young age were a traumatic, turbulent divorce between my parents, where I witnessed many things, including seeing my mom get thrown out of a trailer into a pile of dirt. My dog was gruesomely murdered by drug dealers. I was molested. I observed my mom getting sexually assaulted by her abusive boyfriend, and also my siblings hurting themselves as well. There was a lack of parental supervision, a lack of food, general financial struggles, and just feeling left out. Even moving away from my childhood home and experiencing sexual assault from my first boyfriend, who also was abusive. The main emotions that I experienced in my childhood years were confusion, sadness, and desperation. Desperation to feel seen, to be normal, and just to act like a human, because it always felt like I was on the outside looking in, trying to understand how to be real or exist, because everything always felt so uncomfortable or off. The emotional and even physical neglect that I experienced led to me feeling very invisible in a way, which very much contributes to becoming someone with borderline personality disorder. Life felt very unsettling, and I began masking very early, trying to hide what I was going through internally and act as normal as I could, as much as I knew how to pretend to be. It's very uncomfortable to try to be normal when you don't know what that is. My mom was understandably heartbroken after the divorce. She didn't know how to handle things at all. She came from a place where she thought marriage was just lifelong. So she has expressed how she feels that she did everything wrong after the divorce, that she wasn't there for us, and she regrets it. And I don't hold anything against her personally. I used to actually sneak downstairs and watch her through the vent while she was crying and listening to music. And this was the only time that I saw her cry. This was the only time that it looked like she was actually vulnerable, because the other times I would see cry would be through anger in fighting situations. It was very confusing for me, but I also felt curious about this. I think this laid the groundwork for me not feeling safe to express my emotions or feeling like that it was shameful or something you had to hide when you are feeling unpleasant emotions. I was never emotionally validated growing up, and there wasn't any healthy emotional expression from those around me. And instead of learning how to express emotions in a healthy way with words, I learned to act out with harmful behaviors, following the example of the turbulent home environment that I grew up in. So mom's coping was what I would later do as well. Lots of partying. She would bring me to parties with her or have parties at home, and I would be among all of this while feeling invisible at the same time. I had no idea what normal was, and I felt desperate to be seen or heard, and these adults just wanted to party. I think this invisibility really contributed to me developing borderline personality disorder because I had to make sense of things on my own. I had to try to understand things that I really couldn't understand, and I had to try to feel comfortable in situations that really were not comfortable. I would actually try to get attention by drawing pictures and bringing them out to her because that was really the only time that I got praise, and I felt special when I would get this attention. So this is probably why I'm a good artist to this day. The emotional neglect carried on throughout my teenage years, and my coping mechanisms became more and more unhealthy. And in response to this, my mom got more and more angry. So I also became more angry myself. For instance, when my mom found out I was cutting myself, she got angry instead of compassionate. So instead of trying to understand why I would be doing this, she got mad at me. And of course, this is from her own shame for not being there for me and the fear of seeing your child put themselves through this pain, but I did not understand this at the time. I felt such rage and anger and unloved that I would act out in these over-the-top harmful ways. I would even be so demanding, like demand money from my mom for school when really it was for drugs. So I already started getting this like entitled type feeling inside of me. In reality, I was feeling very sad and unloved, but I was covering this up with anger and fake toughness. I remember my mom making a chore list for the fridge, and I added, "Don't kill mom," because I was really angry and I didn't know how to express myself. And instead of looking into this and asking what was going on, my family ended up making fun of me for it. And I was still pretending to be so strong that I just laughed it off as well. But instead of them checking in on it, I was met with judgment and mockery, essentially. Clearly, that is a cry for help and my aggression coming out. My coping skills were always met with judgment or anger instead of help, which turned me into this label of the black sheep or troubled child, the weird one. I felt such emotional turmoil when I would be hurting myself or having these, what would soon to be known as BPD episodes, that I would feel so intense. I would end up writing suicide notes to my friends as I was cutting myself, but I didn't really want to die. It was just so intense that I didn't know what to do with all of the emotions inside of me. I would cope with drugs, drinking, trying to be a grown-up, like I would hang out with older people. These older people ended up being drug dealers and just very unsafe environments. So I was actually quite lucky to be spared from many things, like when they got busted by the cops, different sexual assaults or overdoses. I was lucky that these didn't happen to me in that drug house. When I was involved with these older drug dealers, I felt the most secure because I was in a gang somewhat. So even that feels better than being the neglected, unliked, unlovable black sheep of the family. Somehow I was able to use this invisibility to keep a low profile and just sit and play video games, whereas other girls weren't so lucky. There was only one incident where I actually had to fight some abusive guy off of me in that drug environment. When I was 14 and still hanging out in that drug house, my mom ended up sending me to Japan to live with my dad. And this was, of course, what was best for me at the time, but I didn't want it. I hated it, and I felt so deeply rejected and unloved by my mom that she could just send me away. So my dad couldn't handle me either because I ended up finding unhealthy ways to cope there as well. I got alcohol poisoning, and he ended up sending me back to my mom. So that also added to the rejection, of course. I felt very unlovable and unwanted, and this sucks because it comes from this cycle of the parents not knowing how to emotionally validate, me acting out because my emotions are so intense, them not knowing what to do with it, me feeling it so intensely, and this dysfunctional cycle that is not healthy in an emotional way. These bad spirals would continue into the adult years, which is why I would eventually get the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I think the final nail in the BPD coffin for me was that I was in a very long relationship, an 8-year marriage that ended up in divorce, and after that, I experienced narcissistic abuse. I found myself stuck in an inappropriate and abusive situation with someone who was posing as a religious leader in a community where I thought I would find normalcy that I did not achieve in my childhood. Unfortunately, the unresolved borderline personality disorder symptoms that were underneath became very intensified and stronger after this abusive situation. And it takes a serious commitment to self-work in order to unravel all of this and get yourself back to inner peace and feeling more healthy. I felt really shameful and angry after that last shocking abusive experience that I was in. So it took a lot of time for me to kind of work through this, process it, and let the guards down even in order to heal from it and move forward. And I really hope that this video helps bring some understanding to the partners of borderlines as well and their families too.